Hi Vegans! I am here to read to you the second to last chapter of the BFG. So if you're still following along, good for you. Yeah, I'm really excited. We're going to start today on page 176, The Plan. The head of the army and the head of the Air Force stood at attention beside the Queen's breakfast table. Sophie was still in her seat, and the BFG was still high up on his crazy perch. It took the Queen only 5 minutes to explain the situation to the military men. "I knew there was something like this going on, Your Majesty," the head of the army said. "For the last 10 years, we have been getting reports from nearly every country in the world about people disappearing mysteriously at night. We had one only the other day from Panama. For the hatty taste," cried the BFG. "And one from Wellington in New Zealand," said the head of the army. "For the booty flavor," cried the BFG. "What is he talking about?" said the head of the Air Force. "Work it out for yourself," said the Queen. "What time is it? 10 a.m.? In 8 hours, those 9 bloodthirsty brutes will be galloping off to gobble up another couple of dozen unfortunate wretches. They have to be stopped. We must act fast." "We'll bomb the blighters," shouted the head of the Air Force. "We'll mow them down with machine guns," cried the head of the army. "I do not approve of murder," said the Queen. "But they are murderers themselves," cried the head of the army. "That is no reason why we should follow their example," the Queen said. "2 wrongs don't make a right." "And 2 rights don't make a left," cried the BFG. "We must bring them back alive," the Queen said. "How?" the 2 military men said together. "They're all 50 feet high. They'd knock us down like 9-pins. "Wait!" cried the BFG. "Hold your horseflies. Keep your skirts on. I think I have the answer to the maiden's hair." "Let him speak," the Queen said. "Every afternoon," the BFG said, "all the giants is in the land of Noddy." "I can't understand a word this feller says," the head of the army snapped. "Why doesn't he speak clearly?" "I can't. He means the land of Nod," Sophie said. "It's pretty obvious." "Exactly," cried the BFG. "Every afternoon, all these 9 giants is lying on the ground, snoozling away in a very deep sleep. They is always resting like that before they is galloping off to guzzle another helping of human beings." "Go on," they said. "So what?" "So, what you soldiers has to do is to creep up on the giants while they is still in the land of Noddy, and tie their arms and legs with mighty ropes and wonkin chains." "Brilliant," the Queen said. "That's all very well," said the head of the army. "But how do we get the brutes back here? We can't load 50-foot giants on the trucks. Shoot 'em up in the spot, that's what I say." The BFG looked down from his lofty perch and said, this time to the head of the Air Force, "You is having belly poppers, is you not?" "Is he being rude?" the head of the Air Force said. "He means helicopters," Sophie told him. "Then why doesn't he say so? Of course we have helicopters." "Whoopsie big belly poppers?" asked the BFG. "Very big ones," the head of the Air Force said proudly. "But no helicopter is big enough to get a giant like that inside it." "You do not put him inside," the BFG said. "You sling him underneath the belly of the belly popper and carry him like a torpedo." "Like a what?" said the head of the Air Force. "Like a torpedo," said Sophie. "Could you do that, Air Marshal?" the Queen asked. "Well, I suppose we could," the head of the Air Force admitted grudgingly. "Then get cracking," the Queen said. "You'll need 9 helicopters, 1 for each giant. Where is this place?" the Air Force man said to the BFG. I presume you can pinpoint it on a map. Pinpoint, said the BFG. Map? I has never heard these words before. Is this Air Force bean talkin' slush bungle? The Air Force Marshal's face turned the color of ripe plum. He was not used to being told he was talking slush bungle. The Queen, with her usual admirable tact and good sense, came to the rescue. BFG, she said, can you tell us more or less where this giant country is? We got the Queen talking to the Air, I don't know which one's which. The Air Marshal, the Air Force Marshal and the Army. And we got the BFG talking to him back. Oh, my lighting. There we go. Right. So again, BFG, she said, can you tell us more or less where the giant country is? No, Magister, the BFG said. Not on mine, Nellie. Then we're jiggered, cried the Army General. This is ridiculous, cried the Air Marshal. You must not be given up so easy, the BFG said calmly. The first titchy bobsicle you meet, and you begin shouting, is bliffsquiggled. The Army General was no more used to being insulted than the Air Marshal. His face began to swell with fury, and his cheeks blew out until they looked like two huge ripe tomatoes. Your Majesty, he cried, we are dealing with a lunatic. I want nothing more to do with this ridiculous operation. The Queen, who was used to the tantrums of her senior officers, ignored him completely. BFG, she said, would you please tell this rather dim-witted characters exactly what to do? My pleasure, Magister, said the BFG. Now listen to me carefully. You two boot bloggers. The military men began to twitch, but they stayed put. I is not having the foggiest idea where giant country is in the world, the BFG said. But I is always able to gallop there. I is galloping forthwards and backwards from giant country every now to blow my dreams into little childers' bedrooms. I is knowing that way very well. So all you is having to do is this. Put your 9 big belly hoppers up in the air and let them follow me as I gallopin' along. How long will the journey take? The Queen asked. If we is leaving now, the BFG said, we will be arriving just as the giants is having their afternoon snozzle. Splendid, the Queen said. Then, turning to the 2 military men, she said, prepare to leave immediately. The head of the army, who was feeling pretty miffed by the whole business, said, that's very well, Your Majesty. But what are we going to do with the blighters once we've got them back? Don't you worry about that, the Queen told him. We'll be ready for him. Hurry up now. Off you go. If it pleases Your Majesty, Sophie said, I should like to ride with the BFG to keep him company. Where will you sit? Said the Queen. In his ear, Sophie said. Show them, BFG. The BFG got down from his high chair, picked up Sophie in his fingers, just like this. He swiveled his huge right ear until it was parallel with the ground, and then he placed Sophie gently inside it. The heads of the army and the Air Force stood there goggling. The Queen smiled. You really are a rather wonderful giant, she said. Magister, the Queen said, I is wishing to ask a very special thing from you. What is it? The Queen said. Could I please bring back here in the belly poppers all my collection of dreams? They has taken me years and years to collect, and I is not wanting to lose them. Why, of course, the Queen said. I wish you a safe journey. BFG had made thousands of journeys to and from the giant country over the years, but he had never in his life made one quite like this, with 9 huge helicopters roaring along over his head. He had never before traveled in broad daylight either. He hadn't dared to. But this was different. Now he was doing it for the Queen of England herself, and he was frightened of nobody. As he galloped across the British Isles with the helicopters thundering above him, people stood and gaped and wondered what on earth is going on. Those helicopters. Oops, let me see. There we go. And there's the BFG. They had never seen the likes of it before, and they never would again. Every now and then, the pilots of the helicopters would catch a glimpse of a small girl wearing glasses crouching in the giant's right ear and waving to them. They always waved back. The pilots marveled at the giant's speed and at the way he leapt across the wide rivers and over huge houses. But they hadn't seen anything yet. Be careful to hang on tight, BFG said. We is going fast as a fizzlecrump. The BFG changed into his famous top gear, and all at once he began to fly forward as though there were springs in his legs and rockets in his toes. He went skipping over the earth like some magical hop, skip, and jumper, and his feet hardly ever touching the ground. As usual, Sophie had to crouch low in the crevice of his ear to save herself from being swept clean away. The 9 pilots in their helicopters suddenly realized they were going to be left behind. The giant was streaking ahead. They opened their throttles to full speed, and even then, they were only just able to keep up. In the leading machine, the head of the Air Force was sitting beside the pilot. He had a world atlas on his knees, and he kept staring first at the atlas, then at the ground below, trying to figure out where they were going. Frantically, he's turning pages of the atlas. Where the devil are we going? He cried. I haven't the foggiest idea, the pilot answered. The Queen's orders were to follow the giant. That's exactly what I'm doing. The pilot was a young Air Force officer with a bushy mustache. He was very proud of his mustache. And he was also quite fearless and loved adventure. He thought this was a super adventure. It's fun going to new places, he said. New places, shouted the head of the Air Force. What the places do you mean, new places? This place we're flying over right now isn't in the atlas, is it? The pilot said, grinning. Darn right it isn't in the atlas, cried the head of the Air Force. We've flown clear off the last page. I expect the old giant knows where he's going, the young pilot said. There he is. Look at his mustache. Right there. He's leading us to disaster, the head of the Air Force said. He was shaking with fear. In the seat behind him sat the head of the army, who was even more terrified. You don't mean to tell me we're going right out of the atlas, he cried, leaning forward to look. That's exactly what I'm telling you, cried the Air Force man. Look for yourself. Here's the very last map in the whole flaming atlas. We went off and over an hour ago. He turned the page. As in all atlases, there were 2 completely blank pages at the very end. So, now we must be somewhere here, he said, putting a finger on one of the blank pages. Where is here? Cried the head of the army. The young pilot was still grinning broadly. He said to them, That's why they always have 2 blank pages at the back of the atlas. They're for new countries. You're meant to fill them in yourself. The head of the Air Force glanced down at the ground below. Just look at this godforsaken desert, he cried. All the trees are dead and all the rocks are blue. The giant has stopped, the young pilot said. He's waving us down. The pilot throttled back in the engines, and all 9 helicopters landed safely on the great yellow wasteland. Then each of them lowered a ramp from its belly. 9 jeeps, 1 from each helicopter, were driven out down the ramps. Each jeep contained 6 soldiers, and a vast quantity of thick rope and heavy chains. "I don't see any giants," the head of the army said. "The giants is all just out of sight over there," the BFG told them. "But if you has taken these slosh-buckling, noisy belly poppers any closer, all the giants is waking up and at once, and then pop goes the weasel." "So you want us to proceed by jeep?" the head of the army said. "Yes," the BFG said. "But you must all be very, very hush-quiet. No roaring motors, no shouting, no mucking around, no piggery-jokery." The BFG, with Sophie still in his ear, trotted forward and the jeeps followed close behind. Suddenly, the most dreadful rumbling voice was heard by everyone. The head of the army went pea-green in the face. "Those are guns!" he cried. "There is a battle raging somewhere up ahead of us. Turn back, the lot of you! Let's get out of here!" Pigs, spittle," the BFG said. "Those noises is not guns." "Of course they're guns," shouted the head of the army. "I am a military man and I know a gun when I hear them. Turn back!" "Those is just the giants snortling in their sleep," the BFG said. "I is a giant myself, and I know a giant snortle when I is hearing one." "Are you quite sure?" the army man said anxiously. "Positive," the BFG said. "Proceed cautiously," the army man ordered. They all moved on. Then they saw them. Even at a distance, they were enough to scare the daylights out of the soldiers. But when they got close and saw what the giants really looked like, they began to sweat with fear. 9 fearsome, ugly, half-naked, 50 feet long brutes lay sprawled over the ground in various grotesque attitudes of sleep, and the sound of their snortling was indeed like gunfire in battle. The BFG raised his hand. The jeeps stopped. The soldiers got out. "What happens if one of them wakes up?" whispered the head of the army, his knees knocking together from fear. "If any one of them is waking up, he will gobble you down before you can say, 'Knack Jeff,'" the BFG answered, grinning hugely. "Me is the only one what won't be gobbling you up, because giants is never eating giants. Me and Sophie is the only safe ones, because I is hiding her if that happens." The head of the army took several paces to the rear. So did the head of the Air Force. They climbed right quickly back into their jeeps, ready to make a fast getaway if necessary. "Go forward, men," the head of the army said. "Go forward and do your duty bravely." The soldiers crept forward, their ropes and chains. All of them were trembling mightily. None dared to speak a word. Look at those giants. So scary. The BFG, with Sophie now sitting on the palm of his hand, stood near by watching the operation. To give the soldiers their due, they were extremely courageous. There were 6 well-trained, efficient men working on each giant, and within 10 minutes, 8 out of the 9 giants had been tussed up like chickens while still snorting contentedly. The 9th, who happened to be the flesh lump eater, was causing trouble for the soldiers because he was lying with his arm right tucked beneath his enormous body. It was impossible to tie his wrists and arm together without first getting the arm out from underneath him. Very, very cautiously, the 6 soldiers who were working on the flesh lump eater began to pull at the huge arm, trying to release it. The flesh lump eater opened his tiny, piggy black eyes. "Which of you foul pesters has wiggling my arm?" he bellowed. "Is that you, you rocksome man-hugger?" Suddenly, he saw the soldiers. In a flash, he was sitting up. He looked right at him. He saw more soldiers. With a roar, he leapt to his feet. The soldiers, petrified with fear, froze where they were. They had no weapons with them. The head of the army put his jeep into reverse. "Human beings!" Flesh lump eater yelled. "What is all you flesh-bunkin', rotsome, half-baked beans doing in my country?" He made a grab of a soldier and swept him up in his hand. "I is having early suppers today," he shouted, holding the poor squirming soldier at arm's length and roaring with laughter. Sophie, standing on the palm of the BFG's hand, was watching horror-struck. "Do something!" she cried. Here's the flesh lump eater and the BFG. "Quick, before he eats him! Put that human being down," the BFG shouted. The flesh lump eater turned and stared at the BFG. "What is you doing here with all these grotty twiglets?" he bellowed. "You is making me very suspicious." The BFG made a rush at the flesh lump eater, but the colossal 54-foot-high giant simply knocked him over with a flick of his free arm. At the same time, Sophie fell off the BFG's palm onto the ground. Her mind was racing. She must do something. She must! She remembered the sapphire brooch the queen had pinned on her chest. Quickly, she undid it. "I is guzzling you nice and slow," the flesh lump eater was saying to the soldier in his hand. "Then I is guzzling 10 or 20 more of you midgety little maggots. Little maggots down there. You is not getting away from me because I is galloping 50 times faster than you." Sophie ran up behind the flesh lump eater. She was holding the brooch between her fingers. When she was right up close to the great naked hairy legs, she rammed the 3-inch long pin of the brooch as hard as she could into the flesh lump eater's right ankle. It went deep into the flesh and stayed there. Check her out. Boom! The giant gave a roar of pain and jumped high in the air. He dropped the soldier and made a grab for his ankle. The BFG, knowing what a coward the flesh lump eater was, saw his chance. "You was bitten by a snake," he shouted. "I seed it biting you. It was a frightsome poisonous viper. It was a deadly, dangerous windscreen viper." "Save your souls!" bellowed the flesh lump eater. "Sound the crumpets! I is bitten by a septitious venomsome windscreen viper!" He flopped to the ground and sat there howling his head off and clutching his right ankle with both hands. His fingers felt the brooch. "The teeth of the deadly viper is sticking in me!" he yelled. "I is feeling the teeth sticking in my anklet." The BFG saw his second chance. "You must be getting those viper's teeth out at once," he cried. "Otherwise you is deader than a duck soup. I is helping you." BFG knelt down beside the flesh lump eater. "You must grab your anklet very tight with both hands," he ordered. "That will stop the poisonous juices from the venomsome viper getting all along your leg and into your heart." The flesh lump eater grabbed his ankle with both hands. "Now close your eyes and grittle your teeth and look up to the heavens and say your prayers while I is taking out the teeth of the venomsome viper," the BFG said. The terrified flesh lump eater did exactly what he was told. The BFG signaling for some rope, a soldier rushed over to him. With both the flesh lump eater's hands gripping his ankle, it was a simple matter of the BFG to tie his ankles and his hands together with a tight knot. "I is pulling out that frightsome viper teeth," the BFG said as he pulled the knot tight. Do it quickly, said the flesh lump eater, before I is pizening to death. There we is, said the BFG, standing up. You can look now. When the flesh lump eater saw that he was trussed up like a turkey, he gave a yell so loud that the heavens trembled. He rolled and he wriggled, he fought and he figgled, he squirmed and he squiggled, but there was not anything he could do. Well done, you, Sophie cried. Well done, you, said the BFG, smiling down at the little girl. You is saving all our lives. Will you please get the brooch back for me? Sophie said. It belongs to the queen. The BFG pulled the beautiful brooch out of the flesh lump eater's ankle. The flesh lump eater howled. There he is, all tied up. The BFG wiped the pin and handed it back to Sophie. Curiously, not one of the other 8 snoring giants had woken up from the shimmazzle. When you was only sleeping 1 or 2 hours a day, you was sleeping extra doubly deep, BFG explained. The head of the army and the head of the Air Force drove forward once again in their jeep. Her Majesty will be very pleased with me, said the head of the army. I shall probably get a medal. What's the next move? Now you is all driving over to my cave to load up my bottles of dreams, said the BFG. Can't waste time with all that rubbish, the army general said. It is the Queen's order, Sophie said. She was now back on the BFG's hand. So the 9 jeeps drove across the BFG's cave, and the great dream loading operation began. There were 50,000 jars in all to be loaded up, more than 5,000 to each jeep, and it took over an hour to finish the job. While the soldiers were loading the dreams, BFG and Sophie disappeared over the mountains on a mysterious errand. When they had come back, the BFG had a sack the size of a small house slung over his shoulder. What's that you've got in there? The head of the army demanded to know. Curiosity killing the cat, killing the rat, the BFG said, and he turned away from the silly man. When he was sure that all his precious dreams had been safely loaded on the jeeps, the BFG said, now he is driving back to the belly poppers and picking up the frightsome giants. The jeeps drove back to the helicopters. The 50,000 dreams were carried carefully, jar by jar, onto the helicopters. The soldiers climbed back on board, but the BFG and Sophie stayed on the ground. Then they all returned to where the 9 giants were lying. It was a fine sight to see them, these great air machines hovering over the tussed-up giants. It was an even finer sight to see the giants being woken up by the terrific thundering of the engines overhead. And the finest sight of all was to observe those 9 hideous brutes squirming and twisting about on the ground like a mass of mighty snakes as they cried to free themselves from their ropes and chains. I is flush-buckled, roared the flesh lump eater. I is spitz-wiggled, yelled the child chewer. I is swalloped, bellowed the bone cruncher. I is goose-gruggled, howled the man-hugger. I is grundle-swiped, shouted the meat-dripper. I is flunk-gungled, screamed the maid-masher. I is slop-groggled, squawked the gizzard-gulper. I is crud-squinkled, yowled the blood-bottler. I is bob-muggard, screeched the butcher boy. Look at all of them. Look at them hanging from those belly poppers. The 9 giant carrying helicopters. The 9 giant carrying helicopters each chose a separate giant and hovered directly over them. Very strong steel hawsers with hooks at the ends of them were lowered from the front and the rear of each helicopter. BFG quickly secured the hooks to the giants' chains, one hook near the legs and the other near the arms. Then, very slowly, the giants were wrenched up into the air parallel to the ground. The giants roared and bellowed, but there was nothing they could do. The BFG, with Sophie once more resting comfortably in its ear, began to gallop for England. The helicopters all banked around and followed after him. It was an amazing spectacle. Those 9 helicopters winging through the sky, each with a tussed-up 50-foot-long giant slung underneath it. The giants themselves must have found it an interesting experience. They never stopped bellowing, but their howls were drowned by the noise of the engines. When it began to get dark, the helicopters switched on powerful searchlights and trained them on to the galloping giant so as to keep him in sight. They flew right through the night and arrived in England just as dawn was breaking. All right, new chapter, feeding time. While the giants were being captured, a tremendous bustle and hustle was going on in the back home in England. Every earth digger and a mechanical contrivance in the country had been mobilized to dig the colossal hole in which the 9 giants were to be permanently imprisoned. 10,000 men and 10,000 machines worked ceaselessly through the night under powerful arc lights, and the massive task was completed only just in time. The hole itself was about twice the size of a football field and 500 feet deep. The walls were perpendicular to the engineers had calculated that there was no way a giant could escape once he was put in. Even if the 9 giants were to stand on each other's shoulders, and the topmost giant would still be 50 feet from the top of the hole. The 9 giant carrying helicopters hovered over the massive pit. The giants, one by one, were lowered onto the floor, but they were still trussed up, and now come the tricky business of releasing them from their bonds. Nobody wanted to go down and do this because the moment a giant was freed, they would be sure to turn the wretched person who had freed them to him and gobble him up. As usual, the BFG had an answer. "I has told you before," he said. "The giants has never eaten giants, so I is going down, and I shall untie them for myself, before you can say Rack Jobinson." With thousands of fascinated spectators, including the Queen, peering down into the pit, the BFG was lowered on a rope. One by one, he released the giants. They stood up, stretched their stiffened limbs, and started leaping about in fury. "Why is they putting us down here, in this grob sludging hole?" they shouted at the BFG. "Because you is guzzling human beings," the BFG answered. "I is always warning you not to do it, and you has never taken the titchest bit of notice." "In that case," the flesh lumper bellowed, "I think we is guzzling you instead." The BFG grabbed the dangling rope and was hoisted out of the pit just in time. The great bulging sack he had brought back with him from the giant country would lay at the top of the pit. "What's in there?" said the Queen. The Queen asked him. The BFG put an arm into the sack and pulled out a gigantic black and white striped object the size of a man. "Snozcumbers," he said. "This is the repulsant snozcumber, Magister, and that is all we is going to give these disgustive giants from now on." "May I taste it?" the Queen asked. "Don't, Magister, don't," cried the BFG. "It is tasted of trog filth and pig squibble." With that, he tossed the snozcumber down to the giants. "There's your supper," he shouted. "Have a munch on that." He fished out more snozcumbers from the sack and threw them down. Here you go. There they go, being lowered into the pit. The giants below howled and cursed. BFG laughed. "Serves them right, left, and center," he says. "What will we feed them on when the snozcumbers are all used up?" the Queen asked them. "They is never being used up, Magister, Queen," the BFG answered, smiling. "I is also bringing in this sack a whole bungle of snozcumber plants, which I is given, with your permission, to the royal gardener to put in soil. Then we is having an everlasting supply of this repulsant food to feed these thirst-bloody giants on." "What a clever fellow you are," the Queen said. You are not very well educated, but you are really nobody's fool. I can see that. There's BFG holding the schnoz cumbers. Alright, and we're gonna stop there for today with just one last chapter. My goodness, there's just a couple of pages. So, yeah, the final reading will be done by Kelly, so tune in soon for that. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed my dramatic expression of BFG, and yeah, thanks for tuning in.